Check, 1, 2, 3, check, check.
Actually, there's not enough for Welcome to all, and our thanks for joining us to celebrate the establishment of the Department of Environmental Medicine, which, to my knowledge, is only the second or perhaps the third such department among the 126 American medical schools. Events of this sort don't happen suddenly, as I believe Professor Rothstein will indicate when he has a chance to make his remarks. They don't occur suddenly in academe, where inertia can exceed that even of a large governmental bureaucracy. Inertia in both institutions is thought to have the benefit of avoiding errors of commission, but inevitably they favor errors of omission. Today we celebrate the commission of this new department, which, far from an error, will propel a long-standing excellent program in toxicology into a new era of research and research training. This institution has an enviable record in both areas. I emphasize the importance of research training to the department's mission. Rochester has made a major contribution to universities, industry, and government by training graduates interested in environmental sciences. We're committed to continuing and enhancing these programs and expanding them in cooperation with government and industry. The important, indeed vital support from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, particularly through its interdisciplinary Center Grant program, has made possible cross-disciplinary programs and facilitated the development of toxicologic and environmental sciences in our institution. The formation of this department can be viewed as an achievement, at least in part, of the extramural programs of the National Institutes of Health, and an example of an ideal form of cooperation between government and academia. It's important that schools of medicine be the academic focal point for initiatives in environmental medicine. I hope that the step we have taken will encourage other medical schools to follow suit. An interesting and important feature of the new department is that it enhances fundamental research in the environmental sciences as applicable to human health both on Earth and in the relatively new environment of the space station. The department includes a new center for space environmental health sciences supported by NASA. In addition, the new division of occupational and environmental medicine and applied discipline will provide diagnostic services to workers and industries to ensure a safer workplace and appropriate medical services for occupationally related illnesses. In an academic setting, this division has an important research and training mission for physicians interested in a career in occupational and environmental medicine. The close interactions of scientists interested in environmental medicine and health and physicians interested in occupational medicine will facilitate the presentation of questions for solution from the clinic to the laboratory and the transfer of answers from the laboratory to the clinic. Now, before introducing our speakers, I want to introduce several guests and leaders in the new Department of Environmental Medicine. First, I'd like to thank Louise Slaughter, a member of Congress from the 30th Congressional District, from taking time from her busy schedule to be with us today. Louise, I wonder if you could stand and be acknowledged. John LaFalce expressed his apologies for not being able to join us because of a conflict in his schedule, but he extends his congratulations to the new department and its members. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Ann Sassaman, who's Director of Extramural Programs at the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. Ann, if you could stand and be acknowledged. There are many people who have contributed to the evolution of this department, and I'd like to mention a few of them. One is, of course, Professor Thomas Clarkson, who directed the Environmental Health Sciences Center in the school before its conversion to the new department. Tom, I wonder if you could stand. And I'd like to acknowledge also Dr. Mark Utel, who's the director of the new division of Occupation and Environmental Medicine and associate chair of the new department for clinical programs. Mark? Other important participants are Professor Angelo Notidis, who's director of the other division of the department, the director of the division of toxicology. Dr. Notidis here? Professor Thomas Gashevitz is director of the educational programs for master's and PhD candidates. And before we ask him to stand and acknowledge him, I'd like to indicate that he has succeeded Professor Victor Ladies, who's with us today, who directed this program for almost 15 years prior to turning it over to Professor Gashevitz. So if they could both stand to be acknowledged. Professor Gunter Oberdorster is the director of the program in pulmonary toxicology. Professor William Merrigan, who can't be with us today, is director of the program in neurotoxicology. And Professor Bernard Weiss is director of the program in interdisciplinary projects. If you two could stand to be acknowledged. I'd like to also comment on the contributions that have been made by Dr. Robert Rawley, former corporate director of health and environmental laboratories of the Eastman Kodak Company, who really was instrumental in the development of our Division of Occupation and Environmental Medicine, and continues to provide leadership for that program in his capacity as clinical professor of environmental medicine since his retirement from Eastman Kodak. Bob, if you would stand to be acknowledged. Rochester has been awarded one of a network of occupational medicine clinics. We have entitled it or called it the Finger Lakes Clinic. This is a worker-oriented clinic which is part of the Division of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. This is an award from the state of New York, and John Melius, who administers this program for New York State Department of Health, could not be with us today, but we do want to indicate the importance of that program in our occupational medicine programs. I also want to recognize four emeritus faculty who are each recognized for their contributions to their field and who their prior contributions have helped in the creation of this new department. Taft Torabara. Taft, are you, if you would stand up to be acknowledged. Frank Smith. Frank. Paul Morrow. Paul. And Robert Wilson. Bob. And lastly, before introducing Dr. Rothstein, I would like to acknowledge the great assistance of three leaders in the school in the development of this department. Vice President Robert Joint, who's with us today. Bob. And Paul Lascelles, Chairman of the Department of Biophysics. Paul. And Professor Marion Anders, who's Chairman of Pharmacology, is he's not here with us. But Professors LaSalle and Anders each had a very influential role to play in the plans for the establishment of the new department. I'd like to express my gratitude to them. And now to turn to the invited speakers. Professor Asa Rothstein came to Rochester in 1940, I learned today. I thought it had been a little bit later. As a student, and rose to the rank of professor and co-chair of the Department of Radiation Biology here at this university, a department which was devoted to basic research and research training. The department evolved from the Atomic Energy Project in Rochester and was focused initially on studies of the potential noxious effects of uranium, plutonium, and radiation energy. After 25 years in Rochester, Dr. Rothstein accepted the position of director of the Research Institute of the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto and became also professor of medical physics at the University of Toronto Medical School. In 1987, Dr. Rothstein became director and professor emeritus. After his department from Rochester, the department which Dr. Rothstein co-chaired, then the Department of Radiation Biology, evolved into a basic science department, the Department of Biophysics, and the new Department of Environmental Medicine. Dr. Rothstein will review some of the historical factors in this evolution. I recall with great appreciation Dr. Rothstein's generosity to me when I was a research fellow and junior faculty member, being provided with the opportunity to conduct research in his department. I'm especially pleased to introduce Dr. Rothstein, who will make remarks about the evolution of toxicology in Rochester.
It's very, very difficult for me in a way to think of Marshall Lichtman as dean, because as he pointed out, I remember him when he was just a fellow. It's really, I have a great personal satisfaction in coming down here for today's dedication, because as I will point out, I was involved in the initiation of toxicology here and helped move it along for a number of years until I left in 1971. On the way down here, we were driving down yesterday, I sort of wondered whether I would still find some people from the good old days around and whether I'd recognize them. Well, as they stood up, you can see that they're the most distinguished people in the crowd here today. They all have a little gray hair, most of them, but I had no difficulty in recognizing them, and I really, you know, it takes me back with great pleasure to earlier times. I don't know, you probably can count, but it's almost precisely the 50th birthday this year of the genesis of toxicology here in Rochester. 50 years ago, when it started, I was a graduate student in physiology, and so I was able to be involved and to follow all the moves and turns and twists and things that happened in the development of what now is this new department. And I'm going to try as best I can remember, and my memory begins to fail me, the very early events that many of you will not know. Just a small few of you were here at that time. Now, I arrived in Rochester in 1940 as a graduate student in the physiology department, as I mentioned, and I was accompanied by a brand new wife who was to study at the Eastman School of Music. And I might say my decision to come here was very much influenced by the desire to keep my new wife happy. So we had to find a school that had the strange combination of music and cell physiology, and Rochester was one of the few schools. The final determining factor, though, was the fact that in its beneficence, Rochester offered me $70 a month as a teaching assistant. My next best offer was $60. Now, these figures may present to you a vision of slave labor, but I'd remind you that in those ancient times the dollar had real value. For example, our first apartment cost $23 a month, including utilities. It happened to be in the red light district. I don't know if it still is. It was at Scioto and Broadway streets. Our decision catapulted me quite unexpectedly into a tumultuous but highly interesting career in toxicology. Soon after I arrived, the United States became involved in the war that was going on. I came from Canada, by the way, and Canada was involved even earlier. And soon thereafter, the decision to make the atom bomb was implemented by the Army-run Manhattan Project. It was soon decided to establish an extensive biomedical research program, anticipating that large amounts of radioactive heavy metals would be mined, crushed, purified, manipulated, machined, and stored. Some years before, in the 1920s, radium had been incorporated into paint for watch dials to allow the numbers to glow in the dark. The painters moistened the paintbrushes with their tongues. Years later, an epidemic of deaths due to bone tumors was traced back to this inadvertent radium exposure. A repetition of this terrible tragedy was to be avoided at all costs. In addition to radioactivity hazards, uranium, to be used in very large amounts, was known already to be a very potent nephrotoxic agent due to its chemical rather than radioactive properties. To cope with these potential health hazards, a medical section was established in the Manhattan Project, and the first chief, or the chief of this, was Stafford Warren, who was professor at the time of radiology at Rochester. He went on to build the UCLA School of Medicine. He established one of the programs at Rochester, and it was to be concerned primarily with developing toxicological information with which to establish health standards for this new and rapidly growing atomic energy industry. The Rochester program was set up virtually overnight. It just appeared all of a sudden. And it was housed initially in the annex across Crittenden. Across Elmwood, sorry. A small existing research group from radiology department was to focus on radioactive hazards, and Harold Hodge, then in the biochemistry department, and a few years ago he passed away, he was appointed to develop programs concerned with chemical toxicity, particularly to inhaled heavy metal compounds. I'd like to digress for a few minutes and to emphasize the strange circumstances that led to Hodge's appointment. A few years earlier, he had received his PhD in physical chemistry at Iowa, and for reasons unknown to me, became a postdoctoral fellow in the biochemistry department at Rochester. And he was working on mineralization, mineral structures of bone and teeth. His selection to organize the toxicology programs of the Rochester project was based on the fact that he was the only pharmacologist on campus, and thereby the only person with presumptive knowledge of toxicology. Now, how did a PhD in mineral metabolism, misplaced in the biochemistry department, come to be the campus pharmacologist? In the late 1930s, the founding dean of this medical school, Hoyt Whipple, who, as you probably know, won a Nobel Prize for his work on the role of the liver in anemia, was faced with a problem. He had not believed that pharmacology was a worthy discipline, and so in founding the medical school, he did not establish a department of pharmacology, nor did he hire any pharmacologists. Unfortunately for him, a visiting accreditation committee did not agree with him. And they said that he had to have a pharmacology course or he couldn't have accreditation. Faced with this problem, the story goes, Whipple was walking along the hall with the first professor of biochemistry, Dr. Bloor, and Whipple asked Bloor who might be seconded to teach pharmacology. Bloor protested that his small staff was already overloaded. At that moment, they passed a lab in which a young man was working who was unknown to Whipple. "Who's that?" he asked. "Harold Hodge, a new postdoctoral fellow. Is he teaching anything?" "No, we can't have him teach biochemistry because he doesn't know any biochemistry." "Then why don't you get him to teach pharmacology?" So on the spot, a pharmacologist was born. Unknowingly, this decision set the stage for the toxicological research that would be initiated a few years later in the Manhattan program. It is of some passing interest that it was not until about 15 years later, sometime after Whipple retired, that the Department of Pharmacology was finally legitimized in Rochester, with Hodge as its first chairman. Because of his interest in hard tissues, Hodge also became a key person in the dental program, evaluation of fluoride toxicity, and fluoridation research. It is evident from what I just told you that chance, rather than intelligent academic planning, has played a key role in the genesis of environmental medicine at Rochester. In mounting the program, Hodge was unable to recruit any of the permanent faculty into this highly secret project, but he did find willing and eager graduate students and fellows. When he talked to me, he could tell me nothing about the work except that it was highly important to the war effort. He offered me the breathtaking salary of $3,200 a year, and that was higher than most assistant professors got at that time. And I was still a graduate student. Remember, in those days, hamburger was 17 cents a pound, and a Plymouth cost $650. So our financial situation was very much improved. We were able to purchase a car and a very small house. Because a high degree of secrecy and security was necessary, a guard was posted at the door of the annex to prevent unauthorized people from entering. When Dean Whipple appeared one morning to see what was going on in this distant outpost of his empire, the guard wouldn't let him in because no one had remembered to get him a clearance. From that time, Whipple refused to have anything to do with the project and never set foot in its premises. In fact, the medical school had a highly negative attitude about this secret project on its doorstep, with highly overpaid, undertrained individuals doing secret and undoubtedly poor science for the Army. The attitude almost killed the project after the war was over. So the future of environmental medicine hung by a thread. But more of that later. When Hodge told me that I was expected to determine the toxicity of inhaled uranium dust, I swallowed a little and turned pale. I bravely said, okay. It was a far cry from my recently acquired skills in studying potassium transport in yeast cells. But with the arrogance of youth, I decided nothing was beyond my capability. I and the others in the group were not only ill-prepared for our tasks, but the science of toxicology, and particularly of inhalation aspects, was primitive beyond belief. There was almost no technology for generating dust of known characteristics, of providing controlled atmospheres of air-suspended materials, of characterizing the airborne material, and little was known of the deposition of particles in the respiratory tract, of the respiratory parameters involved, of the clearance mechanisms in the respiratory tract, absorption into the circulation, tissue deposition, etc., etc. We literally had to invent new toxicology, new technologies, and new science in the fields in which we were completely untrained. When I first entered my new workplace, it was a shock. I was startled by loud, intermittent banging sounds. The source was the first pilot inhalation experiment, initiated a few weeks earlier. A ground uranium compound had been placed in a large salt shaker gotten from the cafeteria. This was mounted on a metal lever enclosed in a plastic box together with a cage of rats. The salt shaker was repeatedly raised and allowed to bang down on a metal plate. With each noisy clang, a cloud of dust arose, which descended on the rats. With each noisy clang, the rats and investigators jumped in unison. Most of the uranium dust settled on the rats' fur, so in a short time they became bright yellow. Afterwards, the animals proceeded to lick their fur clean, so they were eating most of the uranium rather than inhaling it. To overcome this small complication, I was given the job of developing a technology for exposing only the heads of the animals to the dust, so the route of entry would definitely be via inhalation. My first assistant at this stage was a carpenter. We had no plans, no blueprints, no nothing. Clearly, we would need some restraint cages to hold the various species of animals, and that the animals had to be comfortable for a couple hours at a time. And these had to be designed so the animals' heads could be inserted through a hole into the exposure chamber. So we started out, we get a dog, beagle dog. We put him on the floor, and the carpenter and I would kind of walk around him. And then I said, well, cut a piece of wood this long. So we would proceed then to assemble these cages of wire and harnesses and wood piece by piece, using a rat or dog, or not the rats are done differently, rabbits or guinea pigs or dogs as models. We finally got these cages all worked out, and then we were able to design, you've seen these pictures of Shakespearean people with these frilly collars around the neck. Well, we did that with our animals. We had a sponge collar, and then the animals would be pushed into the hole. The collar would form a seal around an airtight seal, and we were able to expose the animals to dusty atmospheres. And at the same time, there were a group of engineers trying to come to grips with the problem of generating uniform dusty atmospheres, determining dust concentration characteristics, etc. Within a few months, we were running parallel series of 3-month experiments on insoluble uranium compounds at different levels, and we were running these experiments 24 hours a day. No sooner would one group of animals be unloaded, another would be loaded in for the next run. Innumerable analyses were done on blood and urine, and at the end of each 3-month run, the tissues of each animal were looked at pathologically, analyzed for uranium. It was really a factory. We were running a toxicology factory. At the end of every 3 months, we would re-equip the chamber with more sophisticated dust feeds, airflow systems, air conditioning units, sampling devices, improving the technology as we went. And we were continually pressed for results, for the production of uranium compounds was being geared up rapidly. To carry out this work, the Army assigned groups of soldiers with any kind of scientific training to the project here. And within the few months, as soon as we started, I, still a graduate student, had 15 people working for me. There were engineers of many kinds, plant physiology, chemists, few biologists. Have you ever tried to teach an electrical engineer to draw blood? For me, it was a crash course in scientific administration, but it proved invaluable in later years. It turned out that the insoluble uranium compounds, which I was evaluating, were relatively non-toxic. In contrast, the soluble compounds studied by other groups were highly toxic, and the worst was uranium hexafluoride. In moist air, it releases hydrofluoric acid. The chamber for its study was located in a separate room, but the building was not really designed for containment, and inevitably equipment would corrode and hydrofluoric acid would fill the laboratory. Fortunately, the human nose is extremely sensitive to hydrofluoric acid, so we got the whiff long before we had to worry about toxic manifestations. And a big alarm bell would run, a siren would blow, and we'd all run out of the laboratories. To give you an idea of how potent hydrofluoric acid is, one time I was getting set to play tennis when this alarm bell rang, and in my hurry to get out, I left my tennis racket on the lab bench. When I came back, the strings were completely dissolved. I mean, there were no strings left. At any rate, the information from the studies we were doing and the others in the unit, from these, the initial health standards were developed for the many individuals now being exposed to these kinds of materials. And fortunately, we guessed right or did something right, because apart from accidents, the safety record was pretty good. After the war was over, the fate of the whole program hung in the balance. The Manhattan Project was taken over by the newly formed Atomic Energy Agency, or Commission. They wanted to continue the toxicological studies on heavy metals, especially chronic exposures at low levels. And they also wanted to maintain a core toxicology group with whom to consult or deal with future problems. But the medical school was really quite unenthusiastic. I've mentioned they had a very jaundiced view of the whole operation. Fortunately for all of us in this room, an acceptable solution was found. The university proposed that the project become an academic unit of the medical school with no secret work. And in addition to the chronic studies of heavy metal and radiation toxicology, that basic academic research would be expanded in the relevant areas. And a critical factor, as the dean has mentioned, was the willingness of the Atomic Energy Commission to accept a major educational role for the project on the basis that future biomedical manpower needs would have to be met in these areas. Another determining factor was the fact that a long-term contract would cover all costs, including overhead and construction of an extension of the annex and the O-wing of the medical school. When the contract was signed, it was to be administered by a new department called the Department of Radiation Biology. Now, for a number of years, this was a department in name only. It wasn't really a department. It was just something on top of a letterhead. There were no appointments. There were no nothing. A few individuals had cross appointments in other departments. But with the passage of time and the retirement of the people who had a jaundiced view of the whole business, it gradually became acceptable. And it became a real department. It had appointments. A number of years later, with some trepidation, the university granted tenure to the staff of the department. So the department was legitimate at last. The education programs were extensive and pervasive. Initially, a master's in health physics trained a great number of people who became health physicists all across the country. There was another program in industrial medicine, and there were standard type master's and PhD programs in radiation biology. Later biophysics was added, later toxicology was added. And at one time, there were over 100 graduate students in the department, and that time, that was half of the total graduate student population of the medical center. So the department really became a major factor in education. And research flourished in the post-war years. Many basic programs were undertaken, including my own in membrane transport. And I was lucky, very lucky, because I was able to combine toxicology and membrane research. For it turned out that heavy metals, such as uranium and later mercury, to be discussed in a minute, act primarily on membrane systems of cells. So they can be used as probes for basic membrane systems, at the same time providing information useful in understanding toxicological mechanisms. The mercury program was started here because at Oak Ridge they had some towers that were 2 stories high filled with mercury, and these were being used as columns to separate isotopes. It was very secretive at the time. And inevitably, mercury escaped and got around on the floor, and they began to really worry about the personnel. So they asked us to come down, and we undertook a program of study of mercury toxicology, mercury metabolism, etc. Now, we did some great studies, published a lot of papers. No one from Oak Ridge or the AEC ever came to ask us about them. So when I asked, how come you guys, started all this, why don't you come and talk to us about it? Oh, we've solved the problem. We just increased the ventilation, and we had 2 shifts of janitors sweeping the floors, and etc. One of the things that this mercury program brought or helped with today's program was that it gave a job to Tom Clarkson. Tom had gotten his PhD in toxicology at Manchester, and he came to Rochester as a postdoctoral fellow, and he was working on my lab, and actually was doing very basic studies on intestinal absorption of salts and water. When Tom came here, he spoke what appeared to be a foreign language. He understood that it was the Manchester dialect. It took quite a few years before he learned acceptable American English. But when he finished his postdoc period, the mercury program was just opening up, and that gave him a slot, and he was involved in the very earliest studies in mercury toxicity, and it's led to all sorts of great things for Tom and for Rochester. This is one of the major centers for this particular form of toxicology. And it's led to today's occasion. You can see from my story that we're all here today because of a series of unlikely past events. These chance opportunities were exploited well, culminating in today's inauguration. The story is still continuing, and I hope I'll be back in Rochester in a few years to see further progress. I can't resist ending with a limerick I once wrote about our capacity to plan for the future. It can perhaps serve as a warning to Tom Clarkson and his colleagues. A rational animal is man. His future he thinks he can plan. But events unpredictable and acts contradictable may put man and his plan in the can.
Thank you, Azer, very much for those insights. I was thinking, as Azer was speaking, that Bob Joint and I, Bob, of course, being the dean of the school before I became the dean of the school, may have appreciated how the first pharmacology professor was selected, because what it says, Bob, is that about 60 years from now, some of the irrational actions we took may end up being complimented, although we won't be here to hear about them. In any case, I also have a vivid memory of a day when I had wished that Professor Rothstein left his tennis racket to have its strings dissolved. We had a group, when I was a postdoctoral fellow and a junior faculty member, that played tennis at noon hour. And Azer and Taft Torabara were among the regulars. And if they didn't have enough players, they would recruit a young whippersnapper like me to join them. And actually, I played with them a fair amount. But one day, there was just Azer and I to play. And Azer said, "Marshall, I don't have a lot of time. I have a meeting, and I've got about 30 or 40 minutes, but we can get some tennis in." So we went out to play. I don't know if he remembers this. And I was ahead 5-1 when the 40 minutes was up. And Azer was not happy about that. So he gave up going to his meeting and beat me 7-5. And that is a true story. He probably doesn't remember. But I began to understand why he had such a high record of achievement after that experience. Frank Young, unfortunately, could not be with us today because he had an unexpected request to visit Homestead, Florida, where, as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health, Science, and the Environment, he's involved in trying to help lead the government's effort to reconstruct that devastated area. I just drove through it yesterday, and it still is quite a wasteland, and he apologizes for not being able to join us today. So for that reason, I'd like to introduce R. Hayes Bell, who will be our next speaker. Hayes is Vice President of Eastman Kodak's Corporate Health, Safety, and Environment Organization. Prior to his present responsibilities, he had been Director of Kodak's Health and Environment Laboratories. Dr. Bell is a member of the National Research Council's Committee on Toxicology and of the Executive Committee of the Chemical Industry Institute of Toxicology. He's been interested in the development of environmental medicine in the university and has facilitated opportunities for medical students to engage in activities at Kodak, has encouraged his staff to participate in our programs as adjunct faculty, and has supported our programs in other ways. We're particularly pleased he can join us today and look forward to his remarks, a perspective on the future needs of occupation and environmental medicine. Hayes. You may want to use...
Maybe I'll use it just like you did. I think I'll just hold it like that. Thank you, Dr. Lishman, Dr. Clarkson, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. I actually am now speaking a little sooner than I thought, so I was thinking that I could maybe make a few more notes along the way there. So now we'll go. I'm delighted to be here for the dedication of the University of Rochester's Medical Center's Department of Environmental Medicine. And I'm especially pleased because our respective institutions, University of Rochester and Kodak, share a long history of scientific and community cooperation. Kodak was one of the first industries in the United States to have its own internal medical department. George Eastman was deeply interested in the health of Kodak people and was personally concerned about providing a safe work environment. As early as 1908, when a physician in the community called about a patient who worked at Kodak, Mr. Eastman would invite that physician to come to visit Kodak and to better understand the working conditions. This was at a time at the beginning of the century when America's industries did not have the same concern for workers' on-the-job health that they have today. And in 1914, the same commitment that Mr. Eastman had for the well-being of his employees prompted him to establish the Kodak Medical Department with Dr. Guy Howe as the first full-time medical director. Dr. Howe had a keen interest in preventive medicine. To give you a sense of how long ago this was, you must remember that all of this took place before America's entrance into the First World War and before many of us were born. In 1936, the Laboratory of Industrial Medicine was founded to enhance the health of our workforce, and Dr. James Sterner, who joined the staff in 1935, became the laboratory's first director and collaborated with Dr. Harold Hodge of the University of Rochester, and we just heard quite a story on Dr. Hodge from Dr. Rothstein. And the two of them collaborated on many toxicology studies. One of Dr. Sterner's major contributions was the relationship of, in correlation of the chemical structure with skin irritation and skin sensitization. Many of the people who helped develop today's modern outgrowth of that laboratory joined Kodak during the directorship of Dr. David Fassett, a cardiologist with serious and previous experience in biochemistry and therapeutics. He was the author of more than 70 scholarly presentations in the area of toxicology, and he was an associate editor of the second volume of Patty's Industrial Hygiene and Toxicology. Now, more recently, the company's health and environment laboratories were led by Dr. Robert Raleigh. And Bob is now playing a very significant role along with Dr. Utel and has major responsibilities with the Occupational and Environmental Division, Department of Environmental Medicine, that we're talking about here today. One of Dr. Raleigh's many contributions was to realize that the health and environmental issues are intertwined. And to address these issues, he oversaw the integration of Kodak's environmental and occupational health activities to form our health and environment laboratories. And that is a further extension of this laboratory of industrial medicine that we talked about with Dr. Sterner and Dr. Hodge, and today plays a very significant role in Kodak's corporate health, safety, and environment responsibilities worldwide. And so Bob was an early one to recognize the importance and the relationship of combining the activities, and it really that there were no clear definitions and no lines between occupational health, safety, environment, and so forth. Time here precludes even a brief history of other key contributors to the laboratory, but suffice it to say that progress, and not always easy, has certainly been rewarding. A very important part of that progress can be found in the historical ties between Kodak and the University of Rochester. The exchange of medical and scientific information over the years has been significant. Kodak scientists have participated as professors at the U of R, and students at the university have taken advantage of professional training opportunities made available by Kodak. Of particular note is the occupational medicine residency program conducted by Kodak, and that program, among others, increased strong academic ties for Kodak. Those ties today are stronger than ever before, and they have to be, for there are great challenges in science and medicine facing the future of occupational and environmental medicine. We must advance the scientific understanding of a wide variety of environmental and medical issues. For Kodak, key issues include those involving toxicology, ergonomics, industrial hygiene, occupational medicine, epidemiology, and environmental monitoring, to name a few. And we must develop and use new technologies to document exposures and evaluate effectiveness of exposure control methodologies. We need scientifically sound, academically solid solutions to real-world problems. We need, for example, to continue to confirm that our products and manufacturing facilities are safe from both a human health and environmental standpoint. To serve our communities well, we need to provide high-quality scientific data to allow others to make responsible policy. In this sense, we must rely on our scientific conclusions to stand up to critical peer review. We must identify where scientific advances should be focused to best utilize resources community-wide. Here, the list of questions is longer than the list of answers. How do you take what you already know, that is, knowledge most readily available through toxicological research, and apply that knowledge to problems of human risk? What is the role of exposure in risk assessment? How do you develop the proper analytical methodologies to evaluate low exposure effects on human health? And how do you use occupational and environmental medical findings to reduce uncertainty in risk assessments? How do we incorporate mechanistic and human data in risk assessment processes? How should exposure standards be set for chemicals identified as reproductive developmental toxicants and neurotoxicants? And how should the rapidly developing issue of immunotoxicology be addressed? How should international harmonization of standards and approaches be achieved? And let's not forget the community. How can we best help non-scientists understand the issues and problems confronting us? How should our two organizations work together with other scientists and the community to solve these common problems? This is where we can leverage the strong link between our respective enterprises, where we can realize synergy through common effort, because the Medical Center's Department of Environmental Medicine and Kodak's Health, Safety, and Environment Organization are working on the same kinds of problems. Our respective activities overlap and can lead to a situation from which good science cannot help but to emerge. Our community is unique in that we are blessed with a wealth of scientific and preventive medicine resources, and it appears from the first speaker that we had a very great history in developing those resources, many of whom stayed in the community and helped us to build, but I believe is an excellent foundation for the new department and for work with the community. Nonetheless, we must nurture and expand our resources. The U of R has exercised leadership, and I would emphasize, and I believe this is correct, is ahead of most other academic institutions in integrating toxicology, environmental science, and medicine to address difficult issues that we all face. But we must understand that we are not the only game in town. We must actively seek and develop other sources of expertise. The university can't do it alone, nor can any one industry. Kodak strives to participate in the advance of scientific knowledge and has supported academic teaching excellence in the community over the years. Kodak people have served as faculty members at the U of R and RIT and others. On another front, Kodak has also given grant support to Drs. Utel and Raleigh and to help them form the new department. And we've supported research consistent with our needs by providing funds for pharmacokinetic research. Kodak has endowed a chair in dermatology currently held by Dr. Lowell Goldsmith, and he supports us clinically as well as in academic research. We've offered support in kind and in dollars, and we've supported the growth of new teaching initiatives in occupational and environmental medicine, and some of these include elective rotations to fourth-year medical students in occupational medicine, occupational, environmental, and epidemiology orientation in our own setting, and teaching at the university, and participation in the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences summer fellowships for medical students here at the U of R, and other similar activities. I see Kodak as a part of a larger community of health, safety, and environmental professionals where issues of mutual interest are addressed. Environmental health impacts our employees and our neighbors, and people of the community have valid questions about these very complex issues. Together, the Department of Environmental Medicine and Kodak's Corporate Health, Safety, and Environment Organization have a wonderful opportunity to work together to raise the community's level of understanding. Together, we must work to achieve a better understanding by the community of perception versus objective data on hazards and risks. Together, we must help our physician colleagues and other health professionals in the practicing community. The Department of Environmental Medicine is a tremendous asset as a source of health, safety, and environmental expertise to this community. Physicians as a group are among the most trusted information sources for the public. The Department of Environmental Medicine can enhance that trust by strengthening the scientific basis for the information being provided by our community physicians. On behalf of Kodak, I wish the new department the best of luck. I'm really pleased to see that the department has been established, and I really look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Dr. Bell was speaking, I was reminded of the remark that Milton Eisenhower made when he was president of Johns Hopkins, and that is that industry and universities are inextricably bound. Universities need money to generate outstanding minds, and industry needs outstanding minds to generate money. And he saw that as a inextricable relationship. I'd like now to introduce Ronald White, who is the chief scientist in the Life Sciences Division of the National Aeronautic and Space Agency. And he is also professor of physiology at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda. After receiving his PhD in physical chemistry at the University of Wisconsin, his interest in chemistry and physics was expressed sometimes in academic, sometimes in industrial, or sometimes in governmental scientific agencies. At NASA, he initiated the agency's Specialized Centers for Research program. One such program, the Center for Space Environmental Health, is headquartered in Rochester in the new Department of Environmental Medicine, with cooperating partners including the University of Colorado, Martin Marietta Corporation, and the Center for Space and Advanced Technology. Today, Dr. White will comment on life and the environment, connections and partnerships. You want me to take this one?
Yeah, I do. Dr. Lichtman, ladies and gentlemen, in a ceremony like this one, someone generally has to take the philosophical high ground, and I'd like you to know that Tom Clarkson has assigned that task to me this afternoon. In fact, though, Tom is scared to death about what I might say here. He told me last week when I was here for a program review that he might have to arrange for an accident for me after I talked. As usual, his timing for prevention was a little off. I am pleased that NASA is connected with this event today. Let me spend a few minutes now telling you why the dedication of the new Department of Environmental Medicine in the University of Rochester Medical School is an important event for us. The subtitle of my talk could very well be Reflections on a Theme of Connectedness. Once, many years ago, I was the director of honors at a state university and had the job of developing an undergraduate curriculum aimed at the best students in the school and leading to a special degree. One of the many things that we tried was a course called The Culture of Man, whose focus was the theme, Everything is Connected, a theme that spoke to both the faculty and the students in many voices. Of course, since then, such stuff has had great attention in a number of schools and even in public television from time to time. None of that, however, detracts from the fact that there appears to be fundamental connections among disparate facts and theories, and even among different disciplines and fields of knowledge, and that these connections play a role in the creation of new knowledge that is often not appreciated. Let me give you a current example of such connectedness in my world. As you heard at the beginning, NASA supports a small number of extramural centers that go by the name NASA Specialized Centers of Research and Training, with the acronym NSCORT, pronounced any way you want it. In fact, I've learned that there are a variety of schools of thought on that pronunciation, including a British school whose major proponent is Tom Clarkson. And they say it the same way that the folks from Arkansas say it. You might not believe that, but we have another center at Purdue focusing on a little different area, and Dr. Clarkson and I were there last week, at the end of the week, for the review of that center, and there was a graduate student from Arkansas who said this term exactly the same way that Dr. Clarkson said it, so I can verify that that's so. The University of Rochester, of course, has a 5-year grant for such a center in the area of environmental health, and I'm the person who monitors that grant, which is one reason why I'm here today, I guess. However, I also monitor all of the other NSCORT grants, and in fact, I invented the whole program with a little help from the National Academy of Sciences and borrowing liberally from other government agencies like the National Institutes of Health. From my own special perspective, it's becoming clear to me that these centers represent an interesting example of connectedness, and let me explain. Each center is supposed to focus on a research theme that clearly requires a team approach in order to make significant research progress. Often the necessary team is a multidisciplinary one, as it is here in Rochester, And sometimes the investigators themselves come from entirely different departments within one or several universities, or from industrial groups and federal government laboratories in addition to universities. Thus, implicit in this approach to research is the notion that synergy among individual tasks is important, and that activities within a center are connected. But as I've discovered in the last few years, the connectedness that I'm talking about is much deeper than that. We currently have such centers in 5 separate areas: environmental health, bioregenerative life support, gravitational biology, radiation health, and exobiology, focusing on the origin of life. We are in the midst of competition in a 6th area, integrated physiology. It turns out, as my thesis says it must now, that all of these areas of research are deeply connected. Let me reflect for just a moment on these connections from an environmental health perspective. Bioregenerative life support concerns itself with issues related to the development of biological components of a life support system designed to support humans in the harsh environments encountered during space exploration. Among those issues are the dual issues of nutrition and toxicity of the various biological components involved, 2 sides of the same coin in many cases. So that center is connected to this one in a meaningful way. Of course, it's a given that NASA's interests in most things relate to spaceflight, and this implies that our interest in environmental health has a space spin on it. Given that this is so, response of subjects to an environmental challenge depends in a fundamental way on the force of gravity. And the whole subject of gravitational biology is seen to be not just relevant to environmental health, but fundamental to it. For example, the absence of convection, sedimentation, and gravitationally induced hydrostatic pressure during much of spaceflight can and often does markedly change the responses of organisms to other environmental challenges. Thus, the Gravitational Biology Center is connected with this one. Radiation health is clearly connected with environmental health in ways that are both historically and scientifically significant. And I don't need to present evidence to this audience that such is the case. In our Exobiology Center, we are studying issues related to the origin and evolution of life. In fact, last week, Dr. Clarkson asked to be put on that center's external committee so that he could talk with the PIs, the investigators in that center, about the possible origin of mercury toxicity and other subjects. And these subjects, of course, are of fundamental importance to environmental health. So that center is connected with this one, too. With this background, I'll leave it to you to develop the connections between environmental health and integrated physiology. But my main point here is that this set of relationships is no accident. The idea that everything is connected is a robust one, and one that seems to have increasing importance to me as I grow older and change my perspective. Let me give you another small example of this notion of connectedness, again, based partially on our NSCORT experience. What we want to foment at these centers is an explosion of new information in our chosen thematic area. And from the inside, from the local perspective of the investigator, that's exactly what we're getting. But if I change my perspective and look at what's happening from the outside, from the global perspective of a program manager in Washington, which some would say is not very global, what I'm finding is that an implosion of knowledge is actually occurring. An implosion, not an explosion. The exploding information leads to connections that simultaneously implode fact back onto itself. This leads to an apparent paradox. In fact, this paradox has become an old friend after all these years of my seeing it in one manner of dress or another. I call it the paradox of the strong relation between opposites, just to give a name to it. It seems that the world works in a way that is counterintuitive to some of our physically based thinking, in that certain opposites are not poles apart, but are actually right next to each other on the tree of knowledge. A simple example of this paradox is the fact that the new and the old opposites are tightly connected. We cannot discover new information without the context provided by old information, and we cannot explain new things without reference to old things. We cannot even define a new word without using old words. For my talk this afternoon, I used the main title, Life and the Environment, to give me a strong model of connectedness from which to spring in a variety of directions. There's an intertwining of life and the environment that we are just beginning to appreciate in all of its facets. The relatively recent interest in such things as global ecology, the vigorous environmental concern being expressed over some by the destruction of the rainforest and the formation of the ozone hole, are all manifestations of the realization that the question of nature versus nurture is an important one for more than the individual. We are who we are, and we are what we are today because of an interaction between life and the environment that preceded life itself. And our friend, the paradox of the strong relation between opposites raises its head here too, because we now understand through recent mathematical models that local events can have global consequences. A poetic expression of this idea is the thought that a butterfly's flight in South America can generate a hurricane in the North Atlantic. Both NASA and the University of Rochester are tinkering locally. NASA is embarking on an experiment in research and training, and Rochester is dedicating a new department in the medical school. We each take our action in the hopes that these local events will have global consequences. But these actions are connected in ways that I hope are becoming clear to you. Let me quickly go down one more path of connection with you. Let me talk about training briefly. We can draw an analogy between training and ecology. In this analogy, training is preparing people, students, to graze in the fields of the mind. Students must learn to distinguish food from poison. They must learn something of intellectual nutrition and food preparation. They must learn to avoid overgrazing in one area, depleting resources and producing lopsidedness. Students must learn to be good environmentalists and understand the relationship between actions and their consequences. All of this argues for a balance between breadth and depth, for a local focus within a global view. All of this argues for a world where connections are manifest and important. My thesis says we are all connected here at this dedication today. Connected by more than our physical presence. Certainly the new Department of Environmental Medicine is closely connected with the School of Medicine. And the School of Medicine is closely connected with the University of Rochester. Both NASA and the National Institute of Environmental Medicine, Environmental Health, are connected with you, with each other, and with the Department of Health and Human Services. Your connections with Kodak and ours are different, but all are important. We are connected with the past, and we journey into the future hand in hand, whether we like it or not. I like it. As I said at the beginning of my talk, I am pleased that NASA is connected with this event today. I hope that what I've expressed in terms of what connectedness is gives you some insight into what I mean when I use that sentence. May this dedication of a new Department of Environmental Medicine bring about the consequences that we all desire.
Thank you very much, Ron, for your remarks. The last formal speaker of the afternoon is Dr. Kenneth Olden, who's Director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and Director of the National Toxicology Program. Prior to his appointment as Director, he was Professor and Chair of the Department of Oncology at Howard University Medical School, and his interest and research in cancer biology has led to his participation on editorial boards at invited symposia and many consultantships, including a presidential appointment to the National Cancer Advisory Board. Dr. Olden has a Rochester connection, having conducted much of his PhD research in Rochester while enrolled in the PhD program at Temple University. I thought of some clever analogy to the remark that was made by John Kennedy when he received a Yale degree, that Ken had the best of both worlds, a Rochester education and a Temple degree, but that really didn't make much sense. But you do have the advantage of having had, at least in part, a Rochester education. Dr. Olden will make remarks on the impact of environmental health sciences research on public health. Nice having you back to Rochester. Thank you. Would you like me to narrate this? Yes, please.
Well, there is a benefit in having a Temple degree and a Rochester education. First of all, a Temple degree is much cheaper to obtain, at least, at least in those days. I don't know how it is now. Well, let me say I'm obviously very pleased to be here today to participate in this celebration of the creation of a new department of environmental medicine. I've known Dr. Clarkson and Dr. Martin Utel for now about 16 or 18 months since I've been director of this institute. And while I've been a lot of difficult and unpleasant activities since I've been director, but one of the things I enjoy very much, and that is my relationship with Dr. Clarkson and Dr. Utel. And anytime we call upon them to give us advice on issues, they are very happy to respond. I think it's appropriate to establish such a department here at the University of Rochester College of Medicine because of the Institute's long-standing collaboration and leadership role in environmental health science research, in toxicology, and in occupational medicine. The Institute has been a leader in the development of collaborative relationships with government, and obviously with industry, to develop and to facilitate the transfer of technologies. The new Department of Environmental Medicine will further and strengthen this interaction by the creation of interdisciplinary programs involving both clinicians and basic researchers. Environmental Health Science Center here at Rochester has enjoyed about 18 years of uninterrupted support from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. The Institute has made important contributions to our understanding of the role of the environment in the etiology and progression of human diseases and dysfunctions. I want to take this opportunity to reaffirm NIEHS's commitment to the Center's program. The Environmental Health Center's program represents the best opportunity for NIEHS to have a more immediate and direct impact on the communities in which the centers exist. We want to have an impact on the life of all the American people, and one way to do that, of course, is to develop center programs that have outreach activities in the communities in which they reside. the centers play an important role in technology transfer, in getting the basic science findings out of the laboratory into the marketplace. To strengthen the center's program, we're going to do the following things. First, we plan to provide additional resources so centers can develop community outreach activities. Second, we plan to provide seed money for the development of new centers to address, and for these centers to address environmental health problems of the poor and the underserved. Thirdly, with the 1994 budget, we plan to request additional resources to support new centers and to support new programs in prevention and clinical research. And finally, we have recently issued new guidelines to make the center's program more rigorous, a move that will allow NIEHS to utilize our very important resources to provide the best research to protect the health of the American people. NIEHS and environmental health science research is now poised to make very important and rapid advances in elucidating the role of the environment in the etiology of human diseases. My task is to translate these findings, is to translate public sentiment for the environment into support for environmental health science research. When I took over this job as director of NIEHS, there was a Gallup poll that was published that's about 18 months ago, indicating that the American people were most concerned about health, number one, and the environment, number two. Now, since we are addressing environmental health, then we certainly should be a national priority. Now, historically, in the research as the country set its research agenda, environmental health science was not very high on the list of priorities. That is unfortunate because the cause of most chronic diseases and dysfunctions are unknown. So it is important that the nation continue to support environmental health science research. Now, with the recent advances in cell and molecular biology, such as the polymerase chain reaction, transgenic and gene knockout technology, new cloning procedures, and improvements in molecular modeling and analytical chemistry, we can now do science that we could not do 10 years ago. Now we can identify biomarkers of exposure, effects, and susceptibility. We can define individual risk. So I predict in the next 10 years that we can make the remarkable kind of progress that has been made with the Human Genome Project. It is anticipated that early next century we will have identified the 75,000 genes that make up the human genome. Now, this is a remarkable feat, considering the fact that each gene is composed of approximately 30,000 bases. Now, if we can make that kind of progress on the Human Genome Project, which no one anticipated when the project started, we can clearly make similar kind of progress on environmental health science research, especially because we now have the tools of cell and molecular biology that will allow us to do so. For example, we can create animals that recapitulate the human predisposition to diseases. We can knock out specific genes, and once the human genome has been identified and different diseases have been assigned to specific genes, then we can ask the question of what impact will environmental exposure have on specific genes, and begin to assign specific functions and interactions between genes and the environment. Now, if I want to really translate, and that is the task that I have before me as director of NIEHS, translate public sentiment for the environment into support for environmental health science research, how are we going to do that? And why is it that our institute has not enjoyed good support for the research program over the number of years? Well, one of those reasons, I think, is that the institute had not and must now define itself in terms of human diseases. We're most known for our studies in toxicology, identifying environmental hazards, and that's fine. But that is just the first cut. In order to really do intelligent risk assessment, one must have information beyond hazard identification. We need to have knowledge of mechanisms. We need to know something about dose-response relationships. We need to know something about the comparative metabolism, excretion of the chemical in humans, in animal cells. Now, to say that we want to increase the number of studies in looking at mechanisms, dose-response relationships, and so forth, does not mean that we should or there should be a retreat from toxicological testing. That is essential. The program must be strengthened. And in fact, we've consistently requested of Dr. Healy and Assistant Secretary Mason that we have more resources for toxicological testing. That is the first cut. That has to happen. But after that, we should not allow risk assessment calls to stand on the basis of hazard identification alone. It is important to initiate studies immediately to try to understand what a finding of positive result in an animal or rodent, usually a rat or a mouse, means for human beings. It is prudent to regulate on the basis of that finding, and it's morally correct to do so. However, the risk assessment that is set based on hazard identification in a rodent should be revisited as new data is generated. So one of the things that we're obviously going to do then is continue to support strong toxicological testing, but we're going to expand the base to include mechanisms, dose-response relationships, and comparative studies in humans. Now, the other thing that we're going to do, and I think is a must if we're going to translate public sentiment for the environment into dollars, and that is we need to emphasize disease endpoints other than cancer. Historically, we have expended about a third of our resources on cancer-related research, and that is fine and that is appropriate. The Institute has made very important contributions to the National Cancer Program, and it has been very important in establishing and setting risk regulation and risk standards by the EPA, FDA, and OSHA, and so forth. However, humans suffer from a number of other diseases or dysfunctions that are caused or exacerbated by the environment, and this institute has sole responsibility for investigating those disorders. So if we don't do it, it will not be done. So we need to broaden the base of our research to include neuroendocrine disorders, immune disorders, respiratory problems, problems associated with older age, such as osteoporosis, reproductive disorders, such as infertility, premature birth, birth defects, and infant mortality. And we are going to broaden our base to include that. Now, I've consistently made a case, again, for more resources. We cannot, I don't propose, I have no desire to cut back on the amount of support for cancer-related research, because what we do in cancer research is important. It's different from what is done at the National Cancer Institute. We collaborate very closely with NCI because, as was mentioned, I am and was on the National Cancer Advisory Board, and I'm personally a good friend of Dr. Broders and most of the people in the National Cancer Institute, since that's where I grew up. The other area that we must develop, I think, if we're going to have an impact on public health and attract the imagination of the American people, is in the area of we must develop programs in prevention and intervention research. We've created a new division within the Institute to provide leadership in that area. We, at the moment, in our current budget, have no dollars set aside, targeted for prevention and intervention research. We propose to develop those programs over the years, and we will be looking for support. I think it's absolutely important. As we understand mechanisms, and we will surely, we can prevent. And in fact, we have basic science findings now in environmental health sciences that are appropriate for testing in intervention and clinical trials. And we must do that. So obviously the next program that I think we are developing, we didn't have before, and that is in clinical research. There are a number of diseases for which there are no animal models. And also the problem that we have in risk assessment, if Dr. Frank Young was here, he would tell you we sit around the table all the time talking about the inadequacy of information that we have to make a risk assessment call, a human risk. And it's usually done on one basis of one observation, and that is a hazard identification. A chemical or physical or biological agent causes a disease in a rodent, usually. There, of course, is the problem of extrapolation from rodent to human. There is the problem of the high dose to low dose extrapolation. Most of us are not exposed to doses that we do, at which we do our laboratory studies. So we're talking about low-level chronic exposure to humans. What is the risk? And you can make that determination and that call if you have better mechanism data, you have good biomarkers, and that we will look for in our prevention and intervention programs, biomarkers demonstrating exposure, demonstrating effect, and demonstrating individual susceptibility. And also it makes more sense if you have an intervention strategy that intervention strategy be targeted to the likely affected population. And all of us are not equally susceptible to every exposure, and so we should target those of us who are, in fact, susceptible and likely to have an adverse outcome. And you can only do this with good science. So what I'm begging for is to put good science into risk assessment, and that's what we need. The other issue that we're going to develop, and I think the public's been responding to these new programs, is a program in environmental equity. I was just about 3 weeks ago spent at a conference in Charleston, South Carolina, where we were talking about differences in cancer patterns in the U.S. and throughout the world. Well, that is one bit of evidence that suggests that the environment plays a role. Because if you look at regional or geographic differences and ethnic differences in cancer patterns, it is likely that the differences in the quality of environment that people are exposed to is at least in part responsible for those differences in disease incidence and differences in mortality. And if you went right down the lines, let's start with cancer, asthma, birth defects, infant mortality, and on and on and on. The individuals who suffer most are the socioeconomic disadvantaged, the elderly, and ethnic minorities. And if you look at where those individuals live, they live and work in the environments that are most polluted and the environments that are where there are more environmental hazards. So that is, we think, an important issue, and it's something that our institute should address in collaboration with a number of other institutes within the NIH. Now, the final thing that we're interested in doing, and that is, and we spend a lot of time doing that, is trying to improve communication within the federal government among the different agencies that have responsibility for some component of environmental health science research and or regulation. In other words, our institute should be talking to the Environmental Protection Agency. We should be talking to FDA and OSHA and NIOSH and on and on. We need communication so that there will not be duplication of effort, unnecessary waste of resources, because we have limited resources and many problems that we don't have resources to address. The only way that we will ever have adequate resources to address the many problems facing this country in the environment is that we coordinate and collaborate, and not only with among ourselves, government, but we have to do that with industry, and we have to do that with academia. So communication is going to be very important. So we believe then that if we truly address all the issues that I've outlined effectively, that our institute will enjoy, not just our institute, just that we won't need more dollars, but you, the American people, will derive benefits in terms of information to improve risk assessment. Environmental health science research will be rapidly and with significantly advanced, and we will find the kind of support that we need. So I am very pleased that there is a new department developed here in environmental medicine, and this is one of the new thrusts of our institute, to bring basic science and clinical medicine together. Because if there is one thing that the NIH has been successful, and that is the juxtaposition of basic science and clinical research have rapidly increased the time, rapidly shortened the time involved in getting laboratory findings to the bedside or to the marketplace. In order to do that, we need the collaboration between business, academia, and government. Thank you.
Let me just connect with you for you. Good. Thank you, Dr. Olden, very much. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to our guests who came from far and wide to be with us and to offer our best wishes to the new department for its ultimate success, which I'm sure is secure. And I do want to invite all of you to a reception to follow immediately, which will be held in the Medical Student Lounge, which is on the floor below this in this building. Now, for those of you who don't know where that is, grab a hold of the sleeve of someone who does and just follow us down to that location. Thank you all very much.